Today we're going to talk about the wean-to-finish economics of OvuGel. What is OvuGel? It's a GnRH agonist that's administered to sows intravaginally 4 days post-weaning. And what OvuGel does, in essence, is it stimulates the release of LH, which induces ovulation for the majority of the treated females in a very narrow period compared to what they would ordinarily do in a natural or conventional state. So we would be expecting 90% of them to synchronize ovulation within a 40 to 48 hour period post-treatment. Because of that, OvuGel facilitates, at least in one of its protocols, the single fixed time insemination of treated animals without reference really to estrus, although there is some observation of estrus still required to optimize the outcome of the target group after the administration of the main group is done. You also have the gilts, which do not qualify for the OvuGel treatment, mixed in. So in a target group, we would expect to have 75% of the animals which were OvuGel females. The sows who are administered OvuGel are bred as a group on the 5th day post-weaning. So they receive the OvuGel 4th day post-weaning in the standard protocol and are bred the next day. And with the target being that ovulation will be there in kind of an ideal moment. What is the essential economics of doing this kind of activity? Why does it make sense? Well, one thing it does is it begins to move the production system into a precision agriculture technology. And one of the first things we know about precision agriculture is that, as a definition, is that it recognizes that all biological production functions are inherently variable. And often, when those production functions interact with humans, that variation can rise. So protocols and technologies which can reduce that variation can often not only save money but increase quality and increase the number of cycles or turns of the production function each year. One of the key dimensions that describes a precision technology is that it somehow allows you to see something in the production function that heretofore you haven't been able to see. So many of you are familiar with the technology in cropping, where aerial photographs or satellite pictures are used to look at fields, and actually through, for instance, infrared color changes, the producer is able to see specific areas of the field where nutrient uptake from a fertilizer application was not successful. And they can take that map or photo and place it within a computer in the in some of the technology used to apply inputs, and be able, with the aid of GPS, to target exactly, really to the square foot, those areas of the field which need it. So, by analogy, what OvuGel does is allow you to, in a sense, see and coordinate the ovulation of the animal, and the current procedure is to try to guess something about when ovulation is occurring by trying to detect estrus, which is only related to ovulation. So it moves us closer to seeing that biological process going out inside the animal. One of the other things it does is it eliminates the multiple matings, which are conventional in modern systems today, thereby saving labor and reducing some costs. So for the most part, the animals are bred only once. In the conventional sense, as everyone knows, because we don't know when ovulation is going to occur, and because it occurs at a variable time after the onset of estrus, we have to simply continue breeding females for as long as estrus can be detected. And that really leads us to a situation that winds up wasting a lot of very valuable inputs, like semen doses. Most of the large-scale databases will show that over 2 on average doses of semen are used on every sow that's bred. Sows administered OvuGel experience really a reduced variance in a period that we don't normally think about, but I think is going to become more important, and that's the wean to farrowing period. So if you think about the period between weaning and the next farrowing of the female, there are really 2 primary stochastic intervals, but there are several others that are embedded in there. And what do I mean by stochastic? I mean intervals which we guess kind of by rules of thumb, but actually for each animal turned out to have a variable length. The first one is the wean to ovulation, or even the wean to expressed estrus period, when mating begins. And then the second one is the length of the gestation period. So if we're able to actually eliminate largely the variation in that first one by inducing ovulation within an 8-hour period for 90% of the animals, what we've effectively done is reduce the variance in that whole period. And then because we know the actual biological gestation length of the animal, instead of guessing from the sow card what it was, one of the protocols for the use of OvuGel recommends the inducing of farrowing at day 114, for instance, of gestation, because there's a very narrow variance around the actual gestational age of the animals. A lot of people are wary about inducing farrowing as a technique simply to fill the farrowing house at an early stage of its availability, because there's so much variability in the actual gestation length of a female and what appears on the sow card. We know that since gestation normally is measured as occurring or beginning the first day the animal's bred, and in fact the animal may not experience fertilization of the ova until as much as 2 days later. So in a sense, that industry-wide method of measuring gestation length is always an overestimate, or nearly always an overestimate. Next, piglets farrowed from these sows then have an increased average lactation length if they're managed properly, and we also can experience a reduced standard deviation of the lactation length. So what we're really talking about is grouping the ovulation of the target group of females so that it occurs during a very narrow time period, and we can then place those animals in the farrowing house when gestation is finished as a group very close to the first day of availability of the farrowing house, and expect that farrowing would occur then later that day or the next day. So when you have a lot of farrowings taking place within a small period of time at the very beginning of the availability of the farrowing house, you really have the maximum use of the farrowing house period to accumulate lactation days. We've done some modeling of this with a fairly detailed stochastic model, and we're predicting about a day and a half of additional lactation length and a reduced standard deviation of about a half a day. And it turns out in some of the actual trials on farms that those numbers are proving to be pretty much accurate. Now you get that with the induction of farrowing. We can certainly hypothesize that with that increased lactation length and reduced standard deviation, by kind of tucking up the tails of the weights of those animals then, because with the increasing average lactation, they also experience an increased average weaning weight of about a pound or a little more, as well as a reduction in the standard deviation of weaning weight. And by tucking that left tail, the lightweight tail, up toward the mean a little bit by reducing the standard deviation, we would expect to have fewer animals that are below the minimum acceptable weaning weight, which for many farms is around 8 or 9 pounds. So we not only prepare animals for the little more hostile environment that they're headed for in wean to finish, transportation and then wean to finish, but we also send more of them because of the reduction in wean to finish culls. If we think about those two stochastic periods again, from weaning to the next farrowing of an animal, we can begin by looking at the duration of estrus. Now, in the normal situation, that is a period of about 48 to 72 hours, and the female experience estrus, as I'm sure all of you know, while they have some common signs of that, run the full range of really showing almost no exterior signs of it, or very subtle signs of estrus, to kind of full-blown expressions that most farm workers would notice immediately. But we have another interval that we have to consider along with the duration of estrus, and that is the onset of estrus until it's actually detected by a farm worker. If you can imagine that in most larger operations, the hunt for animals which might be ready to be bred, that is, experience estrus, for the most part will occur in the morning for maybe an hour or two, and then the animals are kind of ignored for the rest of the day while other chores are done. So if the animal has the onset of estrus at midnight, for instance, it might be 6 to 8 hours before it's actually detected. That is, on the first morning then that someone comes in and actually sees it and begins the mating process. So in other cases, it may be up to 24 hours later. So we don't know at what point in the duration of estrus that the actual discovery was made, but it's within probably the first 24 hours in most cases. Most of the literature and the folks who really have spent the time to ultrasound animals and observe actual ovulation and measure these intervals indicate that ovulation occurs somewhere around 65 to 70% of the way through the duration of estrus. Roughly 38 to 42 hours into a normal estrus period will be when ovulation occurs. But if you really examine the literature on this, you find that while that's the average, it has a very high standard deviation. So high that in some cases, even with relatively small groups of animals, say 50 or 60 as a sample, you're going to get some that ovulate with a day or two after the expression of any sign of estrus has stopped. So, and then of course it can happen much earlier than 70% of the way through. So we use these kinds of rules of thumb, but in actuality, those periods in there are highly variable. And if we have a means like OvuGel to standardize this large range into an 8-hour window, we really have accomplished quite a bit. If you look on the web, or if you look in any textbook on successful heat detection, you'll really see that it's quite a complicated process involving the biology of reproduction and so forth, the many different things that are happening within the sow, the different hormones peaking and rising and falling and so forth, and then the expression of that in in the animal with signs such as swollen vulva or climbing of gaits, high-pitched sounds, mounting other females, and so on. And you can see a relatively complex set of pictures about all that, but then when you really think about how we attempt to understand where the animal is in that cycle, what we do is put back pressure on it. And so it is kind of an interesting conundrum or experience to actually watch that process and ask yourself if it looks like a precision agriculture process. Now, if it wasn't sort of bad enough when you think of one, a typical larger scale farm today with well over 100 animals in the target breeding group, close to 200 or more in some cases, you have individual farm workers trying to detect estrus on this group of sows over a period of time, with each animal showing a different sort of expression of it and ovulating at a different time within that full expression of estrus, including even after it by a day or two. And what you really have is a period within the cycle of the sow, which in a sense is very sloppy when we think about it technologically. It just has a lot of uncompressible time unless you use a technology like OvuGel. Now, if you think about it, one of the very simple explanations of kind of the powerful thing which OvuGel does is that by causing ovulation to occur in most of the animals in a very predictable moment early in the process, you actually wind up without changing any of the technology of the building, adding any crates, or spending another dime really on technology or changing the flow. You wind up with literally older animals because the animals as a group wind up being fertilized at their very beginning earlier in that wean to farrowing period than if you do it conventionally, because we have this wider sort of distribution of days over which the breeding and the ovulation and those unknown periods have to kind of work themselves out. So by grouping all the animals and moving them early in the process, like day 5, we actually establish a large group of uniform animals with a coming into being date or fertilization date, however you want to say that, which is earlier than the rest of the group. So if the animals are earlier in that process and yet they have the same gestation time and time in the farrowing interval as a fixed number of days that a conventional group would have, that's the result that we get in the heavier animals at weaning. They're actually literally older. And if you think that all the way through out to the grow-finish phase, what you have is by any certain day, say the day of the first topping load marketing in the barn, these animals are up to 2 days on average older than those bred conventionally. And in late finishing like that, animals are growing on average of 2 to 2.5 pounds a day, maybe in that range. So you really have, in a 2-day period, a 5-pound gain difference at the same day that we would establish for maybe marketing. So if you do sort of a fair comparison with an equal number of days in the turn, you wind up with heavier animals and animals that are in a tighter standard deviation, as long as disease or something else doesn't kind of mess that up between the time of weaning and the time the animals are ready to market. One of the ways I like to show this is, if you can imagine, those of you who fly a lot, you know that when planes land, they have that little puff of smoke when they burn rubber off the tire onto the runway when they skid to begin to stop. If you look at a picture of a runway from the top, you can really see the distribution of the pattern of those skid marks across the runway. And if you measure from the point of contact to the end of the runway, that's the distance you really have left to safely stop the airplane and get it off the runway. So the earlier on the runway you hit, the more of the runway you have to utilize for a safe stopping of the airplane. The picture that you're looking at now shows that distribution of those tire marks. Well, we have a little animation that sort of illustrates the OvuGel situation. If we have a typical farm first, where the sows sort of come in for a landing at farrowing time, you see the appearance of these little hooves, which are individual farrowings that sort of occur in a distribution over the early days of the farrowing house occupation. But animals that farrow 4 or 5 days into their farrowing house tenure now have fewer days left in the occupancy of the farrowing house to accumulate lactation days and growth of the piglets. So what in essence OvuGel does, and we'll bring up the little OvuGel airplane here now and have those sows farrow, is it places, not all necessarily, but a big majority of the animals earlier into the farrowing house, and therefore, if you can imagine the rest of the runway as being the rest of the time that you have in kind of the limited period, which is the farrowing house occupancy, they get more of it, and therefore we would expect them to be heavier, and because they all came on the same day through induction, in this case at least, you would expect a smaller standard deviation of weights. You don't have to induce the animals. You can still get a benefit from OvuGel simply with the consolidation of the ovulation. And we'll take a look economically at those 3 cases then: conventional versus using OvuGel without induction, and then OvuGel with induction. What you're looking at now is the sort of distribution of weights that could be carried out into grow-finish just by the benefit of that early grouping and farrowing that occur with the use of OvuGel. The red ones represent the conventional animal weights, and you can see that as a distribution, they're a little behind the blue ones. So in order to kind of understand that economically, we modeled this for the grow-finish phase, the 3 cases which I just mentioned: conventional use of OvuGel alone, and then OvuGel with induction of farrowing. So what were the results that we achieved? Well, first of all, the results begin with the lactation length distributions. And as you can see, these 3 distributions overlaying the red, the green, and the blue one. The red one, which is in the background, is the distribution of lactation days, which would be typical with conventional farrowing. So you see a very wide spread of lactation days. The green ones are OvuGel without induction. So essentially what we have working there is only the reduction in variation which occurs from moving the ovulation to a common date, but not from farrowing on a common date. And then if we have farrowing on a common date, we can actually reduce that farther. And you see in the blue distribution all the animals with grouped in a very tight lactation day, a period between 20 and 22 days. Now, you might look at the red one and say, well, we don't really have that many sows that have 2 and 4 lactation days. What we're really looking at is a simulation model that put the farm through 5,000 individual sow matings and gestation periods and farrowing. So over a large number of individual animal experiences, you will have some that have very small lactation lengths because they're aborted for some reason. The process is aborted for some reason. So in this modeling, we think we're able to show that you can expect potentially up to almost 2% fewer animals below 8 pounds compared to conventional breeding using OvuGel alone, and up to 3 or maybe more percent when you use OvuGel plus induced farrowing. That is, animals that are above the disqualification rate. So that can really add up in total numbers over time. There are a lot of numbers on this page, but I want to draw your attention to just a couple of columns here that will circle. We're really looking at the wean to estrus interval, its distribution under conventional farm. In order to get this distribution for the modeling, we're able to use over 1 million sow records from a large national database to look at it by parity, and then with a common balanced parity structure. This is the distribution that we would expect in the wean to estrus interval in a conventional setting. Also, because some gilts have to be added each time to cover fallouts and to keep genetic progress going, you can see at the very far right column, those gilts are kind of added evenly over the week of breeding. And we're looking, just for sake of simplicity, at kind of a single batch farrowing a week, even though we know that every farm has a kind of an idiosyncratic way that they do multiple breedings and multiple weanings a week, and some have nurseries attached to their farrowing houses to group animals. I mean, there's a lot of ways people have tried to manage this variation before OvuGel. So we don't want to just go into every idiosyncratic way to do that, but for simplicity, then we've done it this way, and then you can kind of add what you believe your differences might be to that. If you look at that distribution that's circled, 3% of the animals bred really day one after weaning of the main group, and those would all be gilts, so there wouldn't be any of the wean sows, of course, until maybe day 4. Then you see them coming in pretty heavy with 40%, 33%. Now I turn your attention below the lower part of the table to the OvuGel breeding pattern when estrus basically is not used to determine when breeding is going to occur. And you see that we still have the gilts coming through there every day in order to get the total target number of gilts bred. And we have the vast majority, 82% of the animals, then bred on day 5. Now you will notice that we breed a total number of animals that's higher with OvuGel than with a typical conventional system. And the reason for that is they're in a group of 120 or 30 animals as a target group. There may be up to 8 to 10 of those animals after weaning that you intend to put into the next group and keep, that is not cull, that won't show estrus before day 7. And it turns out on the OvuGel side, those animals are bred anyway because they're bred by day 5. So those animals that would not show heat would be apparently anestrus after day 7, would be eliminated and substituted in the conventional method with another animal that could be found in heat, kind of an opportunity female or something. But in the OvuGel case, those animals are bred on day 5 without reference to whether they show heat or not. However, most experience with OvuGel is showing that probably 30% of those animals will go ahead and farrow normally, even though they never would have shown heat in a conventional system. So that other 70% that will fail to settle, we have to bump up the number of target breds to cover that. Now that does lead to kind of a conundrum with some producers in that the standard way the farrowing rate is measured will not take into account the benefit of moving those 30% of the animals forward, where otherwise in the conventional system they would have to go back to another cycle and increase non-productive days and so on. But the conventional record systems, because OvuGel hasn't been around long enough to kind of become a reason to amend the standard way we look at farrowing rate, will look like the OvuGel animals have a lower farrowing rate. But in fact, they increase the total efficiency of the sow herd by capturing those 30% that would have been sent back to another heat cycle and wind up being successfully bred. Moving to the gestation period now, as remember that second big stochastic period in the wean to next farrowing period, we can look at the two columns there that are in white. You see on the first one, which is the conventional one, beginning with 2.8 and then going 8.9 and 26.5 on day 115. This again is from the million sow records we had in the database. What you can see is that the farrowings are distributed, in this case, over about a 6-day period, and we use the kind of typical conventional protocol that most farms adopt, and that is to induce animals, and even in a conventional system, that go beyond 119 days by the sow card measurement of gestation. So we really don't show any after day 119. In the case of OvuGel, we're accepting the first 2 days in that gestation cycle as the same as the conventional, because we haven't really done anything, and then by inducing on day 114, we try to deliver the rest of the animals on day 115. And then you can see how that extra time then begins to be created in the farrowing house for the OvuGel treated animals. We did another study, which was a poster at IPVS, where we looked at the opportunity cost of using a farrowing crate for late-term gestation. When you move animals from a gestation stall into farrowing house and they linger for 4 or 5 days before farrowing, or even 3 or 4, you're really using a crate, which is 4.5 to 5 times the cost per occupied female than gestation, to carry on the gestation function. So it really represents a waste of the cost of that space while they're using it for gestation. That's dramatically reduced with the OvuGel animals. The table on the slide now is the key output of a comparison of conventional breeding, the use of OvuGel without induction of farrowing, and OvuGel with induction on day 114. The values in the tables represent the endpoint of a stochastic optimization process. So you can see the difference in the wean weight and standard deviation at the top between the conventional OvuGel and OvuGel with induction, where we get a steadily more heavy animal with the grouping of ovulation and the single fixed time mating. Lactation days rise, as you can see there, as well as the standard deviation falling. And we have fewer pigs expected to be below that 8-pound cull rate for moving on to the next phase. What we did next was took the divided the 1,000 animals which were represented in the simulation in each group into 3 groups for marketing. The so-called topping load would be the first truckload animals taken to at their optimal profit level. We didn't use a early marketing of those animals in order to create more space, because again, it's just a layer of complexity that not everybody does, and we wanted to make it something of a baseline look at this. So the first group was taken at its maximum profits, and you can see in the case of the first leading group of animals, there's really a pretty even marketing weight. In the big middle load then, which is everything except a light closing load, which is one truckload at the very bottom. So you have the big middle marketing, kind of the dump of the building after the topping load several days later. You can see the higher weights that accrue to animals which are come out of OvuGel animals, the offspring of OvuGel. Then, even though the weights at the bottom are similar, the standard deviations were less. And if you drop to the red area, you can see the mean profit summary then per head. For the conventional case, given the packer matrix that was used and the cost of feed and the price of hogs, all of which, by the way, were distributions rather than point or average estimates of those distributions were constructed from the last 2 years of corn, soybean meal, DDGS prices, as well as hog prices. And all of them are correlated in the analysis, so that when they were selected for inclusion in the diets, they would represent prices that were correlated in the same way that they were in the last couple of years. You see the mean profit per head gradually increases as we go through the different OvuGel treatments or protocols. In the case of OvuGel, let's put the summary chart up, and I think it'll be easier to see. The increased profit per head is 29 cents more for OvuGel without induction, and expected to be about 79 cents per head more for OvuGel with induction. And if we back that into a per liter profit, it's $3.11 for the OvuGel without induction, $8.38 for OvuGel with induction. And then across the breeding female, based on its productivity, which I think was about a 235 or so, we would expect $7 additional of profit per sow from the use of OvuGel, and about $20 for OvuGel with induction per year for the breeding female. Now, it's also important to recognize that this is simply the profit outcome after weaning. So we did not consider the costs and the benefits associated with the use of less semen or the cost of OvuGel in the early phase in this part of the study. We were simply looking at whether there was a reasonable assumption that we could make about what the profitability comparison might be between conventional and OvuGel animals from the effect at weaning, which is more lactation days and heavier group of animals with a smaller standard deviation, if we take that out through sort of a standard marketing protocol.